In today's lesson, we are going to be looking at one of the ways to collect primary data. So this is going to be kind of one of three lessons focusing on collecting primary data, and this one is going to be looking at observations and experiments. It is a relatively short lesson, so with a couple key terms, so please make sure that you are doing some of the kind of interactive or the warm-up questions and watching a couple of the videos as we go through, just because there's not much to go on with this lesson um, in terms of what we're going to be presenting here. So for the warm-up, there is an article in the online platform called Brain Drain. You can probably search it up as well. It's about kids using phones or students using phones and the impact or its effect on them. So as you read through the article, there's just a couple questions to think about as you read through it. Again, how many people were studied? How would you describe the population that the sample represents? What are the groups that are used to study the participants? What impact does this study have on you personally? And thinking about what are ethics and why are they important in the world of scientific research? Because this article is going to be looking at an observation/experiment of students on the effect of phones. So when looking at or when creating an experiment, right, whether we're doing observations or actual experiments, right, experimental studies are things that we might consider. And an experimental study is a study where a researcher controls what is happening in the study and makes inferences based on these controls. So subjects of the study should be separated into groups. Specifically, we should have at least one treatment group and one control group. A treatment group receives the treatment being measured, so what you're looking for, right? So whether it's like in the example, like having the phone removed or having the phone just placed face down or in a bag, right? That would be the treatment group. The control group is the group does not receive the treatment being measured. So in terms of the phone, they would just be allowed to have their phone or be allowed to continue as normal. Right? So nothing is being applied to the control group. They're just allowed to continue as normal or act as normal without anything applied. And you're basically measuring this or observing, does something happen with the treatment group? Now, some things you might talk about later, or you might consider, right? Treatment groups might consider breaking it up into two groups, right? Multiple groups, depending on the treatments. In some cases, one of the videos that we're going to look at later, or at least mention later, talks about the idea of having a placebo group, which is they think they're getting the treatment, but they're actually not, because there are studies that have been done that the placebo effect is actually real, where you think you're getting a treatment or you think you're getting some sort of medication or something is being applied to you. You think that's what's actually happening, but it's not. It's a placebo. It might be like a sugar pill or something like that, but there might still be some results just because mentally that's kind of sometimes how our bodies can work. If we think we're getting something, then it does kind of have that, just thinking that does kind of have that change. So that might be something you consider in a treatment group. Observational studies. An observational study is where researchers look at situations that are already occurring and then they make inferences. So here we're not applying any sort of groups. We're not separating people or anything like that. We're just observing. Right? Researchers are just looking at what's occurring, and we're not really forcing any change or making any groups or anything like that. We're not giving people anything. We're just observing at what's happening. So to look at the difference between the two, experimental kind of makes more sense. We do have more control in an experimental study, right? You have control over the groups. You have control to ensure that a specific group is getting the treatment or a specific group is getting the control, right? So they're not getting anything. So we have more control over what's happening in your study. However, there are other benefits to the observational studies. Right? Observational studies are more cost effective, right? You just have to observe. You don't have to collect people or recruit people, make them into groups, give them the treatment, call them back to see if there's anything happening, right? You're just observing, so you don't even have to bring anyone into your situation. You can go to them and just kind of observe. It is more ethical, right, in the sense that you're not giving people anything, you're not changing anything, you're just basically observing, right? So there's no third party intervention, things like that. You're just observing. You think an easy thing for that might be to think of observing behaviors in animals, right? If you capture the animal and then you put it in a lab and you do studies on it, that's obviously could be detrimental to the animal, harmful, right? There's all these ethical factors into that. But if you just go into the wild and just observe the animal, right, that's more ethical. You're not doing anything. You're not changing its habits, changing its lifestyle. You're just simply watching and observing, right? So it's more ethical. Regardless of which study you choose, right, the study should be reliable. And the idea with that, again, we touched on that in the first lesson, that if it were done again and again, right, you should get the same results, right? That's the idea of having a reliable study, or making sure that your data is good, or your results are good, is that you get the same results, right? So it should be reliable. Now, these two videos, you can find them on YouTube. They do look at the idea of observational studies or experimental studies and some of the issues within them. The first one, Battling Bad Science, talks about how people can misuse or mislead using studies, or things that they can do in the collection of data, in the experimental or in the observational studies, that can mislead the reader or mislead their data, or skew their data so that it fits their narrative. It does bring up some interesting previous studies, some interesting stories that you might find interesting. The second video is Most Published Research Wrong. This is looking more at the statistical aspect of studies. Right? So in this one, they're looking at how we can use statistical analysis, certain statistical tests, to, in a sense, make it seem that our results are true, but they're actually not, or they're not true to a sense where it makes any difference, or there's any sort of actual statistical benefit, or there's no benefit in that study. An interesting thing, it is a little bit word heavy, but an interesting thing that came up in that video was the idea that most publishers or most articles or journals don't publish studies that repeat other studies, right? Or try to reenact or recreate results. So the whole idea of the study being reliable, in that if you do it over and over again, you get the same results, you're not going to see that, because researchers or publishers don't tend to not want to publish those articles. They don't want to publish something that's already been looked at, right? So you're not going to see articles saying that, oh, we did this study again and we got the same result, or we did this study again and we got a different result. They're going to want to publish something new, something that hasn't been done before. So that's one of the things that, even though we talk about studies having to be reliable, you might not necessarily see, because again, the articles you read, unless you do these studies yourself, you may not find that information. Right? So some interesting things in both. One's a little bit more, one is a TED Talk, the other one is more just a YouTube video. So two different aspects. They're both interesting in their own sense. So please make sure you try to take a look at both of them. They're about 15 minutes each. So again, not too long. So maybe split it up, try to find some time, because it is some interesting information and things you should think about, especially if you're going into any sort of field where you are going to be looking at research papers, or you are going to have to kind of pursue that kind of post-secondary thing. And the idea of reading papers, analyzing, questioning, shouldn't just apply to those going into post-secondary, into university, into the medical field, into the science field, things like that. That's something you should have kind of regardless. You should always be questioning and thinking about where are people getting the information that they're presenting to me. Have they been misleading, or is there any benefit to them misleading? Are there things they could have done that could possibly mislead me? Things like that. So, lastly, the last thing we're going to look at is just a quick example. So, a child psychologist wants to find out if playing video games with violent content makes kids more prone to violent behavior. The psychologist has children come into a lab and has a group of children play a highly violent video game. Right? They're going to be the experimental group. And another group of children play a game with no violence. They're the control group. Then the psychologist watches the children play with other children and records any violent behavior. So this is an example of an experimental study, right? They are creating groups, they're applying the treatment, or they're applying the video games, violent video games, to one group and not to the other, and they're looking at what the outcome is going to be. How could this be done as an observational study? So how could we change this study and make it observational instead of experimental? Right? So different ways you could answer this question, right? Try to be specific about how you might conduct a similar study. So again, take some time to think about it, right? You might get different answers or come up with something different than someone else. Talk it over with someone else if you have the ability to, right? One thing that just you might think of is just go to a school or to a classroom or to a playground and just observe kids, right? Obviously in the guise of an experiment, but just observe, see how they interact with other kids. Do you see kids with more violent behavior than others, right? And then after that, then you can check with parents and say, okay, what video games do your children play? Right? Do they play video games? Do they not? Right? If they do play, what types of games? And then compare that to the behavior that you saw. Right? So you're not applying any treatment, you're just observing the behavior and then checking to see, do those kids that exhibit that violent behavior play violent video games? So that might be one example of how you do an observational study, right? You're not applying any treatment, you're just observing. Discuss the advantages of doing an observational study over an experimental study. Again, we kind of mentioned some of the pros and cons to that already in this lesson. You might think of ones that are more applicable to this scenario, right? An example might be for the experimental study. You're bringing kids into a lab setting, right? Kids going into a new setting might act different, right? They might not act like they normally are. They're in a new place, maybe new children, right? Maybe you can imagine being brought to a new place and saying, hey, play with these kids, right? You have no idea how that situation is going to go. You don't know the age, right? So there's a lot of things you have to control so that those other variables don't play a factor. So again, different things you could think of, different questions or different answers. There's no one right answer, but take a second to think about it. Really kind of question the idea and think about the idea of experimental versus observational. Because again, that is one way that we can collect primary data. That's the one way, or that's one of the three ways that we're going to look at in this unit. The key thing is just understanding the difference between the two and the pros and cons, so that if you do have to complete a study of your own, you can consider kind of those ideas